Okay, we're rolling. Hi there. Welcome to the quarantine college, I suppose. Uh, haven't seen you guys in a while. I miss you. I know you've got a lot going on. Please make that a priority. The rest of this class is just going to be a sort of work at your own pace thing. Um, I'm going to drop the rest of the papers and just have you maybe write up a little something that you can do very easily online uh, that has to do with evaluating a pseudoscience. We'll talk about that more later, but really, for right now, please don't worry about your grades. I'm not going to make that an issue. Uh, People have relatives sick and dying. They're worried about rent and their jobs. And I've got students who are at home with kids uh, that they're trying to homeschool. I've got students who don't have the right kind of computer technology to take online classes, which is why they weren't taking online classes until this happened. Uh, yeah, please just focus on taking care of yourself, and to the extent that you can put effort into this class and want to, please do. Don't worry about anything else. Um, anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Thomas Kuhn and phrenology and pseudoscience in general, and his progression from um, pre-normal to normal science. I'm hoping to elucidate a little bit on the stuff in the previous video. Uh, and then I will locate some reading to do that we can uh, where we can move forward into the next phase of philosophy of science. Um, Honestly, though, I think we'll talk more about that in a bit. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the phrenology case that I posed to you guys. Okay, phrenology is the idea that you can touch people's scalps and figure out and feel the bumps on their head and thus assess their personality. Uh, in the discussion forums, it was someone mentioned the connection between the similarity between this and the personality tests employers give you. And I thought that was a very astute comment. I'm going to touch on the long history of personality assessment in just a moment. But it is connected. And the point I was trying to make with phrenology in relation to Kuhn is that phrenology was something that began in the pre-normal science era and never managed to make it into the normal science phase. Pre-normal science phase, normal science phase. Now, in the pre-normal science, and we'll talk about why. In the pre-normal science phase, okay, sorry, sort of unorganized set of investigations where you theorize that maybe there's a phenomenon out there that you want to investigate, like personality. Like when you go, hey, people are different. Some of them get mad easily, and some of them don't. Some of them are heavy drinkers, and others are abstemious. Um, some are, lazy, and some work hard. I wonder what causes that, and I wonder if there's any way we can figure it out. Um, so this is an accurate assessment, maybe. Um, this is, I think the best way to think about this is that it comes out of the Enlightenment. A lot of these sciences that fail or pseudosciences, uh, the desire to connect personality to physiological traits is the first thing you notice about phrenology. Phrenology theorizes that if you have that every personality trait is connected to a portion of the brain, and if you have more of that personality trait, that portion of the brain is bigger, and if you have less of that personality trait, that portion of the brain is smaller. Now, that's just batshit nuts, we know now. But with their limited knowledge of neurology, I'm willing to cut them some slack on this, I think. But still, the first assumption is that there is such a thing as personality, which is probably a pretty safe assumption, I guess. We'll get more into that later. But the short, spoilery version is that a lot of psychologists think that maybe there's no such thing as stable personality traits. That it may just be largely contextual and situational. Yeah, different people react differently, but like it's maybe not accurate to say someone is lazy, um, because they may be lazy about some things and not lazy about others. I don't even know what that would mean. If I say someone is lazy, what does that actually mean? Yeah, you can say, oh, well, it means they don't like to work. But when you, and that sounds reasonable, but when you start digging at it, it suddenly shows a lot of seams, a lot of weaknesses in the definition. They never like to work, ever, at anything. I've known people who were lazy about a lot of stuff, who were very diligent about things they enjoyed doing. Uh, or people who would go through lazy phases and then uh, other phases where they're very hardworking. Um, I don't know. I don't know if there is such a thing as quote unquote being lazy, uh, like as a general personality trait. I don't know. Uh, Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But anyway, the point being, personality traits are the first thing that phrenology assumes. The second thing that phrenology assumes is a connection between the personality traits and a physiological expression, something physical, the size of a brain region. Okay. Now, and the third thing that phrenology assumes is that the size of your brain region is going to affect the contour of the skull, that the development of the skull is somehow shaped by the shape of your brain. Now, this is another thing that we now know is completely bullshit. It's nonsense. It doesn't happen. So for phrenology to work as a science, all three of those things, for phrenology to work, all three of those things have to be true. There have to be stable personality traits. Those personality traits have to come from enlarged or diminished sections of the brain, and the skull has to, the shape of the skull has to reflect that, so that you can tell which parts of the brain are enlarged or diminished just by feeling the shape of the skull. Okay. Uh, Now, none of those are true, as it turns out. Maybe, well, certainly two of them are. One of them might not be true. But phrenologists don't know that at the outset. They're theorizing, right? They're saying, hey, I think so. And they start trying to look for the phenomenon, the bumps in the skull, and connect it to a consistent set of diagnoses. It's like, hey, I've talked to people who know this guy. They say he's angry, um, and he's got this bulge right here. And then I went around and I found like dozens and dozens of other angry people in the characterization of people who know him, and I found a bulge that's roughly the same, and it's not present in non-angry people, or at least that's what they want to find. That's the hope. Now, Kuhn would say for this to be able to progress into normal science, that's what has to happen. For if this were going to be into from the pre-normal to the normal science phase, it would have to be a situation where they actually found the corresponding evidence. They were able to link it to certain phenomenon and develop methods of investigation and quantification that would allow them to pursue this in a fashion that we recognize as scientific. So, like for instance, what would that involve? Let's think. It would involve first a taxonomy of personality traits. You have to, like some people might say, angry or belligerent or thin-skinned or whatever. You have to sort of narrow down, right? You have to figure out, all right, what are the personality traits? You have to come up with a list ultimately. And there might be some arguments about that. And then you have to match them to the physical phenomena that you're describing. Okay, cool. Now, after that, once you've got that, you can start working on refining the technique. The technique for detecting the physical phenomena. You can start training phrenologists in how to accurately detect and diagnose the physical phenomena. Like, for instance, how do you tell the difference between a bump on the head that comes from the shape of the skull reflecting personality trait and just, I don't know, the fact that you fell and whacked your skull on something and there's swelling? Phrenologists we have to learn how to distinguish between those, right? There's an old joke. I belong to the school of corrective phrenology, which means that if your personality is determined by the bumps on your head, then if I give you a few new bumps on your head, it'll maybe improve your personality, right? That's the joke. Corrective phrenology. But anyway, here's the thing. So that would be what we would imagine would happen in the normal science phase, as far as Kuhn is concerned. So let's think about what happened. Let's think about like anatomy, right? As something that did circulation of the blood, right? Some people started to theorize that the heart was responsible for the circulation of the blood. Well, how are they going to test this? Or how are they going to look at that theory? Okay, well, first of all, they might monitor the pulse, the circulation of the blood, of a dying patient and listen to the heartbeat and notice that those two are connected. They might do autopsies on people to understand how the the blood vessels and veins and stuff are all connected to the heart. They might, and this is horrifying, but in the days before like MRIs and stuff and ultrasounds, they might perform what's called vivisection, which means that you open up a live specimen and observe the heart beating. And so you can try to get, the specimen's maybe not going to stay alive, but vivisection used to be a part of medical practice. It's horrifying, but thank God we don't need it now. But anyway, and observe the heart in action. Um, you could do a lot of things, sort of gather your initial impressions and confirm your initial hypotheses. And once you've got this down pat, then you can start refining in the normal science phase. You can start arguing over what makes the heart. Once you've got, like, okay, the heart does pump blood. Now, what makes the heart better or worse at pumping the blood? How much damage can a heart sustain before it fails to be able to pump the blood? What are the healthy ranges of the pulse of blood circulation? When is it too low? When is it too high? Um, uh, what kinds of things cause the pumping of the blood to speed up or slow down? This would be stuff that happens in the normal science phase, right? Okay, so just like with chronology, in your initial phase, you're just trying to figure out maybe if there is a connection between bumps on the head and personality traits. And then if you get that connection, if it turns out to be a real connection, in the normal science phase, you start trying to refine your understanding of it. How much variation in the size of the bump is correlated with variation in the strength of the personality trait? Which personality traits exist? How do we detect real bumps versus bumps caused by injury? What happens if someone gets like their skull cracked and it heals in a funny way? Does that change their personality, or does it just make it harder to read? What have you? Okay, so that's the transition from pre-normal to normal science. Now, why does, like, say, the circulation of the blood, the study of that, move from pre-normal to normal science and not phrenology? Why would something in the pre-normal science phase move, or fail to move, rather, to the normal science phase? Well, one of the main reasons is that the phenomena they're investigating doesn't exist, or doesn't exist in the way they thought it did, right? Why did phrenology fail to take off as a science? Well, the phenomenon, first of all, the phenomenon of personality traits itself is dodgy. The idea that there are personality traits at all is a dodgy proposition. Might not be true in the sense that we want to think about it. But beyond that, even if they do exist, there's no connection, obviously, between size of the brain. We have pretty well founded belief that, to the extent that personality traits exist at all, they are much more connected to your environment growing up than they are to your brain, or the organic features of your brain. And even in that case, it's not about the size of certain portions of your brain in 99.9 repeating cases. Usually, it's not as simple as, oh, this guy has an enlarged thing in his brain and that makes him more angry. It's much more subtle. It would have to do with chemical balance and stuff like that. It's not a direct correlation between just big portions and small portions. The brain is far more subtle and complex. And last but not least, even if it did have to do with the size of your brain in various parts, that would not influence the shape of your skull. Okay. So, there was never going to be a normal science of phrenology, because there was no way it could pass out of the pre-normal phase. In the pre-normal phase, what should have happened was people should have said, you know what? This is horseshit. We're not finding the bumps that correspond to the personality traits. It doesn't make any sense. It's random. If people feel what they want to feel, the bumps are there. Some of those bumps I'm feeling may have been from childhood injuries, and some are not, and they're just random and they have no connection. Um, the brain, I mean, that should have been part of it, right? Doing autopsies to make sure that the bumps were actually connected to enlarged portions of the brain. I don't think they ever did that. But anyway. Um, and then, of course, there doesn't seem to be any connection to personality. So basically, what would have happened, ideally in Kuhn's model here, is that phrenology becomes a failed science. They're never able to establish law-like connections. They're never able to establish that there are rules about the connection between what happens here and your personality. Now, in actual history, what happens is people in the business of phrenology who have committed a lot of time and energy to it are naturally reluctant to entertain any countervailing evidence, and so they aren't interested in the evidence that this isn't working, and they do a lot of cherry picking of their evidence, and they create charts and lists of personality traits. They create charts and lists of personality traits, and they train people in detection of the bumps, and which is all just really bullshit. But people can believe anything if you prime them for it. And they train them in connections to the bumps, and there you go. And you have a bunch of people who are replicating a falsehood. They think they're out there. There were a lot of phrenologists out there who really, honest to God, thought they were feeling bumps. They were probably feeling just random textures of the skull, but to them, they believed it was significant. And they really believed that there was a connection to these personality traits. They thought they had the evidence. Maybe some of them were honest frauds that knew they were bilking people, that they were lying, but I think a lot of them really believed that this was true. Magical thinking, man. People are bad at it. And the fact that personality traits may be wobbly or not exist at all could have helped that, right? It would have been a lot simpler for phrenology to become a failed science if it had been like, well, your connection, the bumps on your head can tell me whether you're left-handed or right-handed. And that would be easy. He'd go, he's left-handed. And the guy would go, nope. And everyone would go, ah. And that would, okay, we failed. But it's super, it's like with the horoscopes, right? Horoscopes are so vague, right? They're like, you're a Capricorn. That means you want attention sometimes, but you're not always able to tell people that. Well, shit, who doesn't that apply to, right? Sometimes you get angry, unreasonably so. Who doesn't, right? Every single one of the horoscope personality descriptions are so vague and contradictory as to apply to anybody. They're not, you can apply them to anyone. And I think that's because you can write those because personality is not as simple as personality tests or phrenology or physiognomy, we'll talk about that in a second, or any of those things would lead you to believe. It's just not as simple as that. It's people are contextually easy to anger, and contextually talkative, and contextually lazy, and things like that. It all depends. And if phrenologists sort of fine-tune their ways of describing personality traits, yeah, you could get up there and read bumps that you, honest to God, thought you felt, and spit out the personality trait assessments. And if they were phrased vaguely enough, like everyone's going to go, by Jove, you're right. And you think more evidence that phrenology works. So phrenology becomes a failed science, but not a science that acknowledges its own failure, which maybe is one of the things that makes it a pseudoscience, right? Maybe it's a pseudoscience because it fails to acknowledge its own failure. It doesn't acknowledge that there is no actual connection between the texture of the skull and personality, if indeed, maybe because personality doesn't exist, but certainly because if it did exist, it certainly wouldn't have any effect on the shape of your skull. Okay. So that's the pre-normal science to failed science or pseudoscience. We've seen with like circulation of the blood, pre-normal science to normal science, physiology, how do the organs work, start connecting external phenomena to what's happening inside of the body and learning those connections and learning how the organs operate. That's went into normal science mode. But let's talk about the crisis point and a crisis point for science. So this, in a sense, is what happens when, unlike phrenology, where you just got everything wrong, and they just should detour from pre-normal science right into failed science. In some cases, you got like a lot of it correct. It's not quite correct, but a lot of it's correct. Like, for instance, physics for a long time believed that waves of anything, sound, light, whatever, energy can only propagate through a medium. It was the only thing that could happen. Propagate through a medium. Like air or water or solid objects can carry sound. Solid objects don't always carry light. It depends on whether they're translucent or not. But it was believed that light would travel, because of this theory, it was believed that light would travel slower in water, right? Because water is denser than air. It would travel slower in water. And that there also must be some substance, a very rarefied substance that they called the ether, out in space between planets. That stuff must be out there, or else light wouldn't be able to travel from the sun to the earth. What would it travel through? Okay. And that light must travel faster through the ether than through air, because the ether is less dense than air, and faster through the air than through water, because air is less dense than water. Now, this physics got certain things correct. The stuff about sound was absolutely right. And their scientific experiments for sound confirmed in every respect what the theory said. And their understanding of how certain substances can interfere with the passage of light, like a prism can split light, was correct. And how light can be sort of scattered by passing through smoke and things like that, that was also correct. So they had some things right. They had some stuff absolutely right. And their experiments on how light bends in the water in a way that it doesn't in the air, that was correct. So they were correct about a lot of stuff, but they were wrong about other things. Light doesn't travel slower through water, and it doesn't seem to travel any slower in the air than it does through space. And it doesn't behave as though it's traveling through a medium in space. And this became a crisis of, are we just not looking in the right way? Are we missing evidence? Or were we wrong about certain aspects of our theory? And what Kuhn thought was that if something makes it to the normal science phase, it's not out of the woods yet. There still might accumulate problems. Like if you got it more right than you did with phrenology, like if you get everything just like really wrong, you get to pre-normal science and just stop there. You never make it to normal science. If you get some stuff right, you make it to normal science. But eventually the stuff you got wrong is going to catch up with you. And it'll produce what's called a crisis. These are called anomalies, and they produce a crisis where you keep tinkering with your theory and fiddling with your theory and trying to refine it, and like, all right, maybe we need to refine our theory or our techniques or whatever, and eventually the crisis, the anomalies build up, and the crisis is too great, and you realize that no amount of tinkering with your theories or your techniques is going to resolve this, that you got something wrong at the very beginning, at the very foundation of your theory, and you have to completely revise what's called your paradigm, your fundamental understanding of how shit works. It may have been partially right, but it's not right enough. And we got to go back to the drawing board and trash it, maybe take some, and try to figure out something that is more completely correct. And he said this is where you get what's called a paradigm shift from one normal science to another. And that what can be happening during the crisis phase, another pre-normal science can be striking up. People can be saying, well, wait a minute, let's propose this new radical concept of how the world works that handles some of the problems that your theory doesn't. What if? What if there's just hard vacuum in space? What if the speed of light is utterly invariant? It just is what it is. And it starts to develop, and you start working out whether or not it's right. And if it can move into a normal science phase, it can displace the old science. The old science can sort of collapse and fall away and be seen as less useful. And the paradigm will shift from thinking about the world in one way to thinking about the world in another way. This is what happened with Aristotle's four elements science, right? It did explain some stuff. But there was other stuff it didn't explain well, and eventually it was abandoned, right? Like people were like, I'm just not buying it, right? It was eventually abandoned, and we get Lavoisier's new chemistry, and we get a new physics that culminates in Newtonian physics, and we get new sciences that push Aristotelian science out the door. You're just not working, man. And it happens in bits and pieces. The pre-normal scientific theorizations are scattershot. If there are problems, lots of people are going to step up and offer different ways to solve them. And the pre-normal sciences, somebody's going to, eventually one of them is going to move into the normal science phase, and attention and our understanding and the practices will start to shift over there. And we'll be like, oh, okay, this is how we do science now. This explains so much more. The thing is, and the last part of this, and the concerning part, is that you never know if you're according to Kuhn, you have to wonder whether any normal science is going to remain the dominant paradigm, right? Because it can only remain the dominant paradigm if it gets everything right. Or, as some people have suggested later on, if part of that normal science includes a self-correcting mechanism. But even that, it's hard to imagine a normal science that could just stay on top, unless it was a complete and total understanding of how everything worked that was absolutely correct. So, as weird as it seems, Kuhn kind of counsels that we have to look at our current science in a way like we would look at Aristotelian elemental science, the theory of the four elements. Not that we're as wrong as he was, but that we may still be substantially wrong about important things. And maybe we'll accumulate crises until eventually uh, our science is pushed aside by a completely revolutionized understanding of the universe, of how things operate, totally. Um, and an important element of Kuhn's theory is that you can't really communicate between the paradigms. For instance, you can't say, all right, well, what's the equivalent of Aristotle's earth element in the new chemistry? There isn't one. It's not a modification of Aristotelian science. It's going back and throwing out the basic principles of it and reinventing the science, the physics from scratch, the chemistry from scratch, the biology from scratch, in a way such that the terminology and the techniques and the theories of the old paradigm are unintelligible. They are useless in the new paradigm. They're not. They're not. You just can't talk about them. You can talk about phenomena. Like, for instance, Aristotle's trying to explain why smoke rises. That's an observable phenomena. And you can explain that in Aristotelian science, and you can explain that in what we would call regular physics, modern physics. You can explain it in both ways. But you can't, translate the terms of Aristotle to the terms of modern physics. There's just an insuperable gap. The fundamental understanding of how and why that works is just too different for us to be able to use it. So what we're looking at, on the one hand, Kuhn provides a good model, or an interesting model at least, of how science progresses, and how we get from, one model of how things work to another. But it's a little bit chilling because it requires us to sit here and think, oh, crap, someday, we think we know how shit works, and we're very confident, and we've done a lot of cool stuff. We went to the moon. I mean, that's nice, right? The moon. Because like the moon. I don't know why I'm saying it that way. The moon. The moon. I don't know, man. Look, I've been stuck in the house for weeks. Help me! It was a literal cry for help. Anyway. The moon. Where was I? Oh, right. We've done a lot of cool shit. But maybe someday our vaunted scientific understanding will be just as quaint and silly to people in the future as Aristotle's understanding of the four elements and things like that, and the teleology of the universe and the spheres and stuff. Maybe we'll be just as, they'll be like, can you believe people actually believed in quarks? Huh, how ridiculous is that? Quarks. Pfft. It's all just brainwaves and peanut butter. Now we know that, but I don't know. I don't know what it'll look like. I mean, that's the definitional thing, right? That's the funny part. If Kuhn is right, then there's only two possibilities. Either a science manages to actually solve everything and come to a complete and accurate understanding of reality, or it will be displaced by something that we literally can't even imagine, because the terminology of that science will be fully unintelligible. There's no way to explain what an atom is in Aristotelian science, like electrons and protons and stuff like that, and atoms. There's no way to explain that to someone who is operating under the paradigm of Aristotelian science. The terms you would be using would be nonsense. There's no way to explain oxidation, for instance, to people in the Aristotelian paradigm. It just makes zero sense. It doesn't have any. It wouldn't. It wouldn't be intelligible to them. The mental apparatus isn't there. So, someday we can't imagine what the new science will be because we lack the mental apparatus. So think on that. Ha! Anyway, that's what we're doing. I'm going to put up some stuff for you to read about maybe some failed sciences or things like that, and then we'll and maybe we'll have some discussion about that. Please use the discussion boards. We've only had 2 posts on there other than mine, and I'd like you to use them. Log in when you can, and just talk to your fellow classmates. Watch the videos. Like, share, and subscribe. No, I don't give a shit, but that's what YouTubers say, isn't it? I don't care if you like, share, or subscribe. Well, you should subscribe. You're in the class. I miss you all so much. All right.